Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Northshire online event. Thank you so much all for being here this evening. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Rachel Person. I'm the event manager for Northshire Bookstore in Saratoga Springs, New York, here with my good friend and colleague, David Wood, event manager for Northshire Bookstore in Manchester, Vermont. And he's going to introduce our guests in just a moment. But before he does, I'm just going to point out, as you came in, you may have noticed that this evening's presentation is being recorded for a subsequent broadcast on our YouTube channel. But fear not, we have the settings arranged so that only those of us who are unmuted and speaking in the nice yellow boxes that you'll see around me will show up in that recording. So you may have your camera on and we will not be putting you up on YouTube. In light of that, please do use the chat box for any questions that you have this evening. You can type your questions in at any time, and we will store them up and ask them for you when we get to the Q&A at the end of the event. So make liberal use of that. And then last of all, thank you all so much for being here and for your incredible continued support and loyalty to Northshire over these last couple of pandemic years. It's been a tough time in small business world and bookselling world, and we owe our continued existence as stores to all of you. We couldn't do this without you, and we are incredibly grateful to you for your support and for being here with us tonight. David, why don't you go ahead and introduce our guest tonight?
Thanks so much, Rachel. It is my great pleasure to welcome Radhule Weininger to Northshire for her new book, Heart Medicine: How to Stop Painful Patterns and Find Peace and Freedom at Last. Dr. Weininger is a clinical psychologist and teacher of Buddhist meditation and Buddhist psychology. She's the co-founder and guiding teacher of the nonprofit Mindful Heart Programs, which offers a safe refuge for meditation and education programs in mindfulness, meditation, and nature connection in Santa Barbara. She's the author of Heart Work: The Path of Self-Compassion. Her latest book, Heart Medicine, is heart medicine. Sharon Salzberg says that it's forged during 40 plus years of study and practice of Buddhism and Western psychology. Heart medicine illuminates how obstacles triggered by trauma can become growth opportunities when held with awareness and understanding, and is a welcome addition to the canon. While Tara Brock says that the book is a beautiful invitation to discover and heal the persistent patterns that create suffering in our lives. It reminds us that when we touch what is painful with awareness, the armoring around our heart melts and frees us to reconnect with our full aliveness, wisdom, and love. We are lucky to be joined tonight by Dr. Michael Kearney, a palliative care physician, the husband of Dr. Weininger, and the author of numerous books, most recently The Nest and the Stream: Lessons from Nature on Being with Pain. Please join me in welcoming to Northshire Bookstore, Drs. Michael Kearney and Radhule Weininger. Take it away, guys.
Okay. Thank you so much, David and Rachel, and thank you everybody for being here. I would like to start by just saying that we actually haven't talked about the questions that I'm going to pose to Radhule this evening, even though I'm kind of familiar with her book and we've talked about it many times. We haven't actually discussed these questions, so some of them will be coming as a bit of a surprise. So as David mentioned, Radhule, your first book is Heart Work: The Path of Self-Compassion, 9 Practices for Opening the Heart. And your new book is Heart Medicine: How to Stop Painful Patterns and Find Peace and Freedom at Last. And so the first kind of question I'd like to ask you is, why did you feel you needed to write the second book? Having written Heart Work, what was the impetus to write Heart Medicine?
Well, first, good evening, and thank you, David, very much for inviting us, and thanks everybody for coming here. But let me answer your question, Michael. My books come very much out of my own personal experience. You know, I think I came to Buddhist practice as well as to psychology out of my own work on myself. You might say my own work with my personal suffering. And so developing self-compassion was a really important thing for me to learn. And I realized that even learning mindfulness meditation, which I began practicing 1980 in a monastery in Sri Lanka, didn't necessarily teach me self-compassion. So that was like a big undertaking for me, especially coming from a somewhat harsh post-war German background. It was something I really needed to learn, and as I learned it, I thought I wanted to share that with others. Then I realized that beyond self-compassion, some other medicine was needed. That I and many of us have these long-standing, recurrent, painful patterns that kind of trap us and trip us again and again during our lives. That we feel, wow, why do I meet this dynamic again? Just with different players. And especially my mentor for 20 some years, Jack Cornfield, he really encouraged me to not just work on it myself, but to think about how to help others with long-standing, recurrent, painful patterns. And I also felt that mindfulness, I was aware of it, which goes more to the moment by moment understanding of our triggers and naming our difficult emotions, wasn't quite getting to the root of working with long-standing patterns. And so that's why I wrote the second book.
Thank you. And you mentioned triggers, and I wonder, could you say a little more about long-standing, recurrent, painful patterns? And we hear a lot about triggers, and I think we all understand what that means, sort of events that just trigger our reactivity. Is that what we're talking about when we talk about LERPs, or is there something distinctive about long-standing, recurrent, painful patterns? And you might have noticed I referred to LERPs, but that is the actual onomatopoeic kind of pronunciation of. So could you just speak to that a little bit? What's distinctive about a long-standing recurrent pattern? Is it a form of trigger? Is there something different?
Well, I think LERPs, long-standing recurrent painful patterns, or C.G. Jung called them complexes, or in the Buddhist philosophy they are called samskaras or shankaras, depending on Pali or Sanskrit. They are getting instigated by triggers. For example, some of my LERPs are around abandonment and rejection and being kind of left out, which comes from my background where I was, the illegitimate kid in a Catholic family and feeling kind of a little bit like an outsider. So that feeling of feeling like an outsider, feeling not quite part of it, feeling easily rejected within a group, I would say is one of my LERPs. And so that LERP gets triggered when I, for example, see an email of somebody disinviting me to their birthday party, or not inviting me to their wedding, or whatever it might be, and or maybe feeling snubbed by something where probably anybody would feel a little twinge, but where it can really put us into a tizzy, where we feel in our bodies just really unwell, where we feel either winded or really angry, where we have all these symptoms of feeling something really hit us hard, maybe a little bit more than we would expect according to what actually happened. That is what I would call a LERP.
So a sense of the reactivity being out of proportion, perhaps, to the trigger event is one of the distinctive things of a. Could you say any more in terms of any other characteristics in terms of recognizing that I've been LERPed?
Yeah, so the first one is a body feeling often. Everybody is a little bit different, but definitely a body feeling winded, feeling suddenly tight, maybe in our jaw or shoulders, getting a headache, maybe feeling nauseous or dizzy. There are many different, like suddenly not hungry anymore. Those kinds of body feelings are there. And then strong emotions, or maybe numbness. It could be either going either way, really frustrated or really sad or just really numb. It's a kind of a trauma response. And then rumination. Often it brings up a lot of circular thinking and just not being able to let it go. And maybe then feelings like not being able to sleep or just feeling just really off. And sometimes we have really a post-traumatic stress trauma response, like feeling a bit dizzy or dissociated. Or sometimes what happens, we generalize our feeling. We think, oh yeah, it's not just this person who rejects us, but it's the whole world that rejects us, or maybe our whole community. So there are more signs, but these are some of them. And maybe I want to say it's important to notice that we have gotten LERPed, because that already takes that free floating anxiety away. And it's like going to the doctor and saying, oh, I feel really weak and sick, and I say, yeah, you have the flu. It doesn't make it necessarily better, but gives us a starting point to work with it.
So maybe that brings us on to my next kind of questions was, if we recognize that we have been triggered in such a way that it's kind of unleashed one of our long-standing recurrent patterns, and I hear what you're saying, that even recognizing that we've been LERPed is actually a very positive step in terms of responding to it, so we're not just carried away in the flow, so to speak. But can you speak a little bit to, where how we can respond from there? And your experience in your work is as a psychologist, as a clinical psychologist, but also as a meditation practitioner, Buddhist meditation practitioner and teacher for both for nearly 40 years now. So could you speak a little bit to kind of some of the first steps in terms of and how Western psychology and Buddhist psychology can work together in a positive way?
Yeah, I do think that East and West, especially for us Westerners, I don't know if everybody, whoever is here, let's say in modernity, maybe not Western, let's say in modernity, we often do need both medicines. And what we have from Western psychology is telling our story, understanding what happened, seeing it within context, being able to feel our feelings and our emotions. And that's really important. And I think also what comes from our Western background, or let's say modern background, is self-compassion. I remember when I was from Sri Lanka to my Tibetan friends, self-compassion isn't really something that they know much about.
They being whom?
Let's say my Tibetan friend, Buddhist friends, or when I studied in Sri Lanka, it's for them it's close to self-cherishing, which isn't so good. So, but we realize in modernity, in our modernity here, maybe in our background here, we do need this self-compassion, because there's so much self-loathing, so much perfectionism. So there is this self-understanding and self-compassion that's really important to just calm our system down, and not to get into rumination and about just being completely self-preoccupied, but at least some simple understanding and validating and warmth towards ourselves. And then another medicine is just mindfulness meditation as we know it, noticing what's going on, being present with what is, with our thoughts, with our feelings, and knowing their impermanence, that they pass by and that they arise and disappear. And then, what I learned from Pema Chödrön, staying with our feelings is often really hard. So not distract ourselves, but being with the felt sense, not with the rumination, but with the felt sense of what's happening, because that brings us into the present moment, and that is where change can happen. And then some of the other medicines I mentioned are compassion for others, like it's not just as we are suffering, others are suffering. And forgiveness, those resentments that we often are holding, those grudges, they burden us. Maybe the person who hurt us, like Jack Cornfield says, he's probably in the Bahama drinking his Mai Tai, but you are still sitting here being resentful. And so it's burdening us. However, it has to come naturally and we can't press a forgiveness button. It's a longer process. And then I talk a little bit about letting the mystery in, which I learned a little bit more from my Tibetan teachers, to feel as part of this interdependent world and experiencing that, and coming from this wider perspective of awareness, and from that perspective to be with our suffering, and from this wider perspective, which is a little bit beyond, reaching a little bit beyond our separate self, to bestow compassion and warmth from that perspective on us and others. And I think the last, there are other medicines, but one I really wanted to mention is service. Because sometimes in our suffering, we can become a little solipsistic, or, not seeing beyond ourselves, and we start to feel weak and very preoccupied. And sometimes I think Judith Lewis Herman, who worked a lot on trauma, talks about a survivor mission, taking what we learned eventually, not maybe right away, but eventually out, and be helpful to others, not as a self-sacrifice, but as something that makes us stronger and feel more connected and also less afraid.
Great, well, thank you for taking us through the steps there. Just if I wanted to just go back to in the first part of your book, you have one of the chapters is entitled "Freedom is Possible." Now, freedom is possible is the third noble truth, as I remember it. But I was thinking, what does freedom from a LERP look like, or freedom with a LERP? I mean, what can we expect? As you know, I work a little bit in the area, working in palliative care. I work sometimes crossover into helping people with chronic pain. And one of the things we often have to do with folks with chronic pain is together kind of agree on what realistic expectations of outcome are going to be here. We're not going to fix it all. So when you talk about freedom is possible, is it possible to fix one of these long-standing recurrent patterns? If so, what does that look like? And if not, what are we talking about when we talk about freedom from alert?
I think there's a whole continuum. I think those LERPs, they come, who knows where they come from? Definitely from our childhood. Maybe some are transgenerational. Who knows? Some people might believe in past lives. we don't know. It's kind of, they're, quite mysterious. And I think one thing I noticed in myself is we can take those lerps out of the driver's seat into the back seat, so they don't, stir the car anymore.
But they're still in the car.
They're still maybe in the car, and I don't know if they're always in the car. Sometimes they might be leaving the car. I find my lerps, I still feel a pinch, twitch in my heart, but I don't feel like so reactive anymore, or maybe sometimes not at all. And it doesn't prevent me from having a happy life. And that's also what I see with my clients and my students, that slowly, it's like almost, actually Tibetan teacher told me it's like growing out a toenail where that had been, had a blemish, it slowly grows out. And I think with all the practices we are doing, we are helping it to grow out. And I think we feel increasingly free and more time unburdened and more creative. And I think the second half to that is to begin seeing this suffering, these lerps, as a portal, because I think I came from a medical family and actually went to Germany through med school, and was supposed to take over my mother's clinic. And I always say, without what happened to me, my accidents, my lerps, I would be an unhappy radiologist in Germany now. Or, I would not have, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't have written these books. And so I think I'm actually grateful now, for some of the things that happen, because they led me on a really interesting path.
And that's not to romanticize the path. I mean,
no, it's painful.
It's been painful. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But you've come to a place where there is that, the lerp is still there, but there's also greater freedom.
Yeah, there's greater freedom.
The wound is still there. Maybe.
Yeah, and but maybe it's becoming a scar.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's maybe not bleeding anymore.
Mm-hmm. I know. I've kind of read, some descriptions of enlightenment from a Buddhist perspective as being the eradication or the healing of all negative states and the flourishing or the blossoming of all positive states. I think, as I understand it in a Buddhist context, that's often seen as the work of many, many, many lifetimes. So I hear you talking about how we can work with lerps with a kind of certain humility, that progress is possible, but at the same time, it may not be possible to reach that eradication of all negative states. Mm-hmm. Or maybe it will.
Yeah, but for sure we will be more happy.
Uh-huh.
Our propensity for happiness will be more, and to be available in this world, to be of service. Mm-hmm. This is a very rocky world right now. At least many of us experience it like that. And I find a lot of our lerps are triggered right now. Not just in our family, but what's happening. Social discordance or climate change. All of that brings up our deep sense of insecurity and lack of safety. And if that had been part of our past, that's being warmed up again. And so if we can become aware of that and not shut down, but rather stay present, then we may be able to become useful in keeping our world alive and healthy.
I know I remember in your first book, you talk about the kind of trigger event and then the cascades, but you talk about how important it is to think about the sort of background field, and whether our background field is kind of one of stress and tiredness and hunger and anxiety. If that's our background field, we're likely to be triggered a lot more easily, and kind of go down perhaps that kind of reactive path. Whereas if our background field is more mindful and more self-aware, and more spacious, then even though the same trigger event may come along, we then have the capacity to recognize it, and maybe to make some choice to go in a different direction. How do we cultivate that background field?
Thanks for that question. It's a great question. And I think it is in some ways a longer term project, like practice, meditation practice, psychotherapy. Both of that is a longer term project. And I think I find just having a regular meditation practice slowly gets us a different ground under our feet and lets us be more at home in the world. And it kind of washes out a little bit the dust on our eyes, you might say. And working with our lerps, like if we have a few nasty lerps, let's say about abandonment, rejection, competition, feeling afraid of people being aggressive, from our background, we just kind of scoot around trying to not feel hurt or being very defensive. And so if we can live without that, then the background field we are living with is clearer. And yes, then the cultural background field comes in, which kind of creates some weather pattern there that's difficult, but it's good if it doesn't get even more confounded and darkened by our personal weather pattern.
Okay, thank you for that. I wanted to come to there's a quote that's actually in the conclusion of your book, and I just wanted to read this quote and ask you if you would to sort of comment on it. At this point, you've gone through the 12 steps that you describe for addressing and healing, if that's the right word, our long-standing recurrent painful patterns. Then you say this in the conclusion. You say, many steps are critical, but the most challenging step is loosening our identification with the drama in which we're entangled. The most challenging step is loosening the identification with the drama in which we're entangled and opening to a wider, more spacious perspective. Ultimately, I had to ground my practice of mindfulness and compassion in deeper soil, the great mystery, the field of awareness, which has the quality of stillness, presence, aliveness, love, and luminous knowing. Rooting the practice in the great mystery finally frees us from our lerps. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, what I'm talking here to is, I think not identifying is just so really difficult. I remember getting quite frustrated with some of my teachers who said, oh, just disidentify. I thought, how am I supposed to do this? This is incredibly difficult. And, some we can do in therapy with putting the lerp on a chair and talking to it, or we can see it as a dream image. And all of that is hugely important and helps with kind of making us have a bit more spaciousness.
And you include that as one of your steps.
Right, between us and our the little creature that's suffering, that feels like sitting in our neck. But as I realized, as I became, especially when I became um, aware of and practiced and started to teach some of the practices from I learned from my Tibetan informed teachers, where you learn to rest in this field of awareness. So it's not just awareness as a verb, but it is something that's already there. And I think in many spiritual tradition it has a different name, but there is more spaciousness, and there's something there that's a priori already okay. And if we can feel that in our direct experience, and then basically look back from that very clear and awake vantage point, then there is a lot more space. And then it's easier to be compassionate and to be forgiving. And so I found that band of more effortless mindfulness or awake awareness really important, especially when working with LERPs in our meditation platform. That's usually what I'm teaching these days, and mindfulheartprograms.org. So it's our free meditation platform. Anybody can join. So does it make it clear? So if we can ground ourselves in the spaciousness, in that what is, where there is stillness and a sense, actually the Dalai Lama calls it a field of benevolence. And it sounds very abstract. One has to really experience it. And interestingly enough, I experienced that very first when I was in Sri Lanka in this monastery, and I was there after 2 car accidents and a stomach ulcer and problems with my family. I was 22, and I remember I didn't know what would happen if I sit down on my cushion, if there was the original terror, or I didn't know what would be there. And I was really surprised that the longer I sat, week after week, a few months, that there was actually the sense of peace and freedom and spaciousness, and that's something one recognizes after long retreats. And I think those Tibetan informed practices allow us to come there a little quicker in the morning meditation, which is wonderful. So I find that spaciousness and tapping into that not as an escape, but as a way to come back to work with ourselves and our world, really important.
Beautiful, thank you. Really, I'm just going to just briefly, quickly go through the 12 steps, because there's a question I want to ask you. The first one is recognize your LERP. The second one is be mindful of body, thoughts, and feelings, so mindfulness. The third one is self-compassion, seeing a LERP with self-compassion. The fourth one is healing complex suffering with compassion for all, so extending it beyond oneself, compassion. The fifth one is creating mindfully, setting clear intention and dedicated motivation. The sixth one is, when triggered, press the pause button, or what you call the mindful pause. The seventh one is learning to stay with suffering. The eighth one, breathing through to let be and let go. The ninth one is forgiveness. The 10th one is loosening the grip of identification. The 11th one is letting in the mystery. And the 12th one, as you mentioned earlier, is service, bringing all of this outwards. Now, what you've just described, this sort of spacious awareness, is that what you mean by letting in the mystery? And my question really is this a linear process that you envisage here? These different steps? Is it really important, first of all, to kind of establish mindfulness and self-compassion, and do the kind of psychological work
Right.
before one comes to the effortless mindfulness? Or is that something that you can bring in earlier to sort of help with those other
I
stuff?
think one could bring it in earlier. Actually, it was a discussion between me and my editor. I wanted it earlier, and she said, no, it should come later. So, and I think in lots of the different steps, I have 35 practices in this book. I give different options, and often, let's say, with compassion, you can have compassion from a place of I and thou, like Martin Buber might have called it. I feel compassionate with you personally, or it could be uh, I, as part of the greater field, feel compassion for you. And actually, it's an important distinction because, especially in your field, nowadays we often talk about compassion fatigue. Do we get burned out in our compassion? And I think if it comes from this individual self point of view, I feel bad for you. I rather feel bad. I feel compassionate for you, Michael. And if that happens a lot, there could be a sense of burnout and overwhelm. But if I'm able to connect to a wider perspective, and it's more like, how did St. Francis say it? May I be an instrument of peace. No?
I'm thinking of the glass with the
Yeah, so it's more, Jack Cornfield has a great example of that. It's like if you put a spoonful of salt into a glass of water, it's very salty. If you put a spoonful of salt into a lake, it's not salty at all. So if we come from this lake perspective and um, give or share our compassion with others, then we don't get this burnout or secondary traumatic stress or whatever it's called nowadays. So moral distress disorder, which is especially for so many caretakers now a huge reason for burnout. So just to come back to your question, in many of these steps, there are different options. We can come from the personal, or we can come more from the universal in most all of these steps. For example, loosening identification, we can work as a dream image, the little creature that's bereft in us, and talk to it or feel it. Or we can, connect to this wider space. And because there's so much spaciousness and knowing, not spaced out, it's a very alert and clear knowing, then it's easier to let that identification go a little bit. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. So, I mean, related to that, you mentioned your discussions with your editor. I mean, is there anything, when you look at the kind of structure of the book as it is now, as it's gone out there, that if you were writing it again, is there anything you would kind of emphasize in a different way or say in a different way?
Well, maybe I would bring in the mystery a little earlier, but I also see that the way books are organized, it's coming often more towards the end. So maybe that's something I would more boldly change a little bit.
And I think you do, as I remember it, you do, I think in part 1, chapter 4, you do have a chapter on the medicine of awareness. So you did find a way of bringing it in earlier.
Yeah.
So, coming towards the end of our discussion, our part of the discussion, before opening, and hopefully some of everyone listening will have some questions that you'd like to put to Radhule. But and if you do so, as David said, please do so in the chat box. But at the very end of your book, I think these are actually the final lines in the conclusion, you talk about His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and you talk about the trips you've made to Dharamsala, where he lives in India, to listen to his teachings, which you've done for several years. Can you say a little more about that? About where does he come in all of this?
Kind of
you?
like a very wise and benevolent presence. I really got to know him first. I went to Dharamsala really not with the main goal of seeing the Dalai Lama, that's where he lives, but to take my teenage children to teach English to Tibetans. I felt they needed to get out of Santa Barbara, and I just wanted them to have a different experience. My youngest son was a little troubled, and I thought, I'll just travel with him and do this. And so I got to know my Tibetan friends, and then I was very much identified with Theravadan Buddhism, so I wasn't really that open. But then I realized there was something about them, how they were with suffering, and especially how the Dalai Lama is with his own predicament, that was coming from the sense of fullness. And I met monks who had been in Chinese prisons and they weren't destroyed. And I had worked with Survivor International, where I worked with survivors of political torture and so many people who were quite so wounded. And so I became curious. And the Dalai Lama seems to me, he's just kind of such a rock in that he's so consistent, and not getting full of himself, it seems. He is really present. He kind of is one of the teachers who preaches what he teaches, who lives what he preaches. And so I just really and I just love every year to sit there, not now with COVID, with all Tibetans and foreigners and everybody, and listen to him. And he always talks about interdependence. And where the world is right now, I think that's one of the most important lessons for us to learn right now. And he says, when we can really understand, grok all our interdependence with all of life, then compassion would be the natural next step, because then everybody is kin. Then nobody's excluded. And then love is kind of the natural response, and that just really impressed me.
I think your final line in your book is, "Now I understand that interdependence is the message for the healing of the lerps of the world."
Yeah.
So thank you, Radhule. I want to thank you, and I want to hand back to you, Rachel, and to you, David, to take it from there.
We have some great audience questions that have been coming in the chat and our DMs, and we'll start with those. And audience, we'll get to as many as we can, and if you have more, please type them in the chat and we will try to get to them. The first question we got came in from Patricia, saying, "I've seen research that suggests that trauma can be passed on in our DNA for as many as 14 generations. What does your research suggest about that phenomenon?"
Yes, that is consistent with the research I have been doing there. I haven't heard the 14 generations yet, but many generations. I think it's the methylation on our genes that changes with trauma. And I think it's what we all along suspected. People, like many of us who work with people who have been severely traumatized. And so, yeah, and it's very true. Thank you.
Thank you, Radhule. The next question is from Madison. She asks, what would you say the difference is between rumination and felt sense in trying to connect to the suffering and yourself? And follows up, how can you tell when you're not ruminating?
Okay, actually, that's an amazing question. I think that. Thank you. Actually, I wish I had the Gentling quote here. Would you find it in the hard work book quickly? Um, Gentling actually coined the word felt sense. And felt sense is our physical sense of something happening. And rumination is our mind spinning here. Okay, here. Psychologist Eugene Gentling called the felt sense a special kind of internal bodily awareness, a body sense of meaning that the conscious mind is initially unable to articulate. The felt sense not only brings you into the present moment, but it increases relaxed alertness. The moment you experience the felt sense of painful feelings is exactly when change can happen. The felt sense helps you recognize when you're afraid, hurt, angry, or ashamed. And because of that recognition, you can begin to gain insight into the meaning that experience has for you. So, and rumination is basically our mind spinning, going on, and on, reiterating it in our mind. And I can only recommend, let's say you lie awake and you can't sleep, and your mind um, is spinning in that ruminative way, to come back. Where do you feel that in your body? I think I described that. Could you give me one more time? Hard work. It was in my first book, Hard Work. I think I really describe how I work that in part one, Finding the Heart, where I really come from rumination to felt sense, and I describe a little bit how I found that process for myself.
So, but am I understanding right that you're saying the rumination is essentially a mental process,
Yeah.
kind of a bit like a hamster spinning its wheel around and around, kind of same thing, just coming back again and again and again and seeing if it's a little different this time. Whereas the felt sense is actually going much more to the somatic and
The body.
the emotional, the kind of the actual experience of
Right.
how the body holds that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Fascinating. Thank you. Jennifer asked you to repeat what does LERP stand for again?
Okay. Long-standing, recurrent, painful pattern. So it's usually there for a long time. It comes again and again in different clothes, in different events, different people. And it's painful. It hurts.
Thank you for the clarification. Janet asks, could you give an example of the last of those steps you were speaking of earlier of service?
Okay. Um, for example, it could come in many ways. It's like for me, becoming a, a therapist was really healing, not to just work on myself and to look deeper and deeper and deeper, even though, I'll probably never end with that. But to share what I learned with others. Same with meditation. But service could also be helping your neighbors, or working in a community garden, or anything. What does Joanna, our good friend is Joanna Macy, and she says, service is everything that you do for more than your self gratification. Something like that.
When you act with more than yourself in mind.
Yeah, and I think that is good. I think we need to learn to practice community in a way in this country. We
Could I just kind of add a kind of a rider to that question real quick? I mean, do you think the kind of service that's healing of the LERP is a kind of service that's related to the wound?
Mm.
You know, so helping others who suffer in a similar way.
Yeah, that is definitely true. Man, I could see that in my own practice that I often have people who are orphans or were adopted or excluded, or that seems to be I'm an expert. But I also work with a lot of other people, but it seems to come. And or I remember it's like if you were an orphan yourself, maybe it's particularly significant to work with others who were kind of left alone and abandoned as children, or so if your service has something to do with what is a medicine for you, like the antidote, but it doesn't have to be,
And not as a should.
and not as a should. Yeah, I would hold that lightly.
Patricia asks, do you recommend journaling to help interrupt alert?
Definitely, I think journaling is it's a wonderful thing, and I think in my first book Heartwork, in the end of each chapter there are journal questions. I think I didn't do that in the second book, but I think that's a wonderful way. And I think as you journal, even there, I would recommend that you notice what's going on in your body and in your heart, and don't get into ruminative journaling where you just write the same thing over and over again, kind of mentalizing.
Thank you. That was wonderful. We are just about out of time, but I would love it if you could wrap up by telling us a little bit more about your Mindful Heart programs and what you do with those and where people can find you for them.
Oh, thank you so much. Yes, we started a nonprofit, us and a few friends of ours, and I worked through a retreat center here in Santa Barbara, La Casa de Maria, which unfortunately was destroyed by a mudslide, and so that was for us. The beginning where we said, okay, we need to start this nonprofit. And first it was, we had a mindfulness and compassion facilitator training, and we wanted to give people scholarships. So that's why we made this. Then we started a school program that now became quite big, and they got taken in by a big nonprofit in Santa Barbara, and now in many schools. We have quite a big online platform every day of the week, free of charge meditations. And you can go to mindfulheartprograms.org. Maybe you can put it into the chat, Mindful Heart Programs, or should Michael put it in the chat, or can you see it? Or
We can pull it up.
yeah, or my website, radhuleweiningerphd.com. And we have also events there sometimes. I do with Inside LA together, a monthly event working with LERPs. I think it's every last Sunday of the month from 12:30 to 2. And it's, I think, organized through Inside LA, but together with Mindful Heart programs. And so we tried before, we had longer retreats, but right now all our retreat centers closed down or fell off the mountain. It's very sad here in Santa Barbara. So we have to reorganize and find places where to give retreats. But we have the newest thing I just started is every morning from 7:30 to 8, which is 3 hours later for you, where we do just a half-hour meditation. People can zoom in, they can come whenever they want and zoom out. And so we have quite an extensive program there, and just look it up and see what you like.
Radhule, Michael, thank you both so very much. This has been a fantastic event. We really appreciate it. And I'm terribly sorry about the center that happened in the mudslide. That's awful. But thank you both so much for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it. And I know we've all had a wonderful time.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thanks, you, Rachel and David. You were wonderful holding the space, and want to thank everybody who took time out of their day to join us here.
Yeah, thank you all. Thank you.
Yes, thank you all so much. And you can find.
Thank you all so much. We'll see you at another Northshire live event, a Northshire Presents virtual event sometime soon. And take care. Have a great evening.
Bye-bye.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.